Good evening, and thanks for tuning in. Tonight's stories from Reddit bring strange encounters, eerie moments, and memories that never seem to fade. Perfect for late-night listening, or for when you want to feel the chill of the unknown. Settle in, and let's begin. I found an ocean in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. We've been drifting for weeks. It was spring break, and 3 of my closest friends and I were going on a road trip. Jason, a red-headed oddball who I've known since I was 5 years old and never quite managed to shake off, organized the whole thing. He found an ad advertising an RV return gig. A small company that rented them out had one left in a lot on the East Coast and needed it to be driven back to the main showroom in Montana. With a few clauses, this meant that not only were we getting it for a week for free, but we were also getting paid for the trouble. Or, at least, Jason was. At a push, the amount he was receiving would just about cover fuel, food, and alcohol, with a little extra thrown in from the rest of us. Jason invited me, of course, Julian, a close enough acquaintance who'd recently come out of a long-term relationship and was trying to start a songwriting career off the back of it, and Austin. Austin had only recently shaken off the nickname Frodo, which had stuck to his 5'3" stature all the way through high school. As much as we made fun of him, Austin was a great guy, one of the nicest people I know. With nothing better going on in any of our lives, we all happily agreed to Jason's proposal. With 4 days' notice, I packed a week's worth of clothes into a duffel bag and dropped my dog, Boxer, and my elephant ear plant off at my girlfriend's apartment. My girlfriend, Kate, lives with 2 roommates, one of which apparently is deathly allergic to dog hair. I pretended not to hear her as I turned to leave. We said our goodbyes in the hallway and parted ways for the next week or so. We decided to convene in a shopping mall parking lot, which was near enough for all 4 of us. I was the first to arrive and couldn't stop myself from laughing as I walked up to the RV that would be my home for the next week. One of the windows had shattered and was replaced with a black trash bag duct taped to the seams. It hadn't been cleaned from the last renter's use and was covered in mud that darkened the white-beige paint job. The panel door swung open and Jason stood there in a bathrobe. "Welcome to the mothership," he roared. "Nice robe," I said as I shrugged past him and into the van. I threw my bag onto one of the 2 beds, claiming it as my own. "Thanks, I found it on the bathroom floor," he informed me, gesturing towards the closet that was, apparently, where the toilet stood. I looked at him and could tell he wasn't joking. We sat and talked about his grand ideas for the trip while we waited for the other 2 to turn up. As we did, he unfolded a comically large map of the contiguous United States and laid it out on the tiny folding table. Red pen marked our route from Wilmington to Bozeman, cutting mainly through the Appalachian Mountains before heading abruptly north. "It's going to average out at around 5 hours of driving a day," he told me, chewing on his pen. "Should we go in shifts or?" I asked, leaving the question open-ended. At that, Jason waved his hand in front of me dismissively. "No need, I'll be driving," he said. "Are you sure?" I responded. "Totally," he continued. "It's the best seat in the house. Besides, Austin still doesn't have his license, and I couldn't put up with Julian complaining about cramps for hours on end." We laughed, and almost on cue the door swung open. Austin and Julian entered in a mock 3 Stooges sketch and said their hellos. Jason informed them of the sleeping arrangements, giving Julian the pull-out seating and directing Austin to the floor. After a while, we'd all settled in and Jason slid behind the wheel. He pulled out of the parking lot and onto the open road, determined to cross state lines before midnight. The 3 of us not shackled to the wheel spent the rest of the evening drinking and playing cards. Julian was halfway through explaining the rules to a card game neither of us had heard before when Jason pulled into a small diner and parked up. We all bundled out of the Winnebago and crowded into the small diner, which wore its Americana charm on its sleeve. We ate well and paid, and as we left, Jason beckoned me over to him. He handed me an old Polaroid camera from his bag and told me to take his picture next to the dented "Welcome to Tennessee" sign. "Are you gonna do this with every state?" I asked him as I took the photo. "Absolutely," he replied, grinning and holding onto the metal pole the sign stood on like his life depended on it. We took another photo. This time he posed with his thumbs up before boarding the RV. He drove a little further until we found a place to park up for the night. By this point, 3 out of the 4 of us were hammered. As we got ready to sleep, Austin kept repeating the word Winnebago in a shitty British accent, making a pop culture reference too obscure for any of us to get, drunk or sober. Austin then collapsed onto his makeshift bed of a blow-up mattress, supplied by Jason, on the RV floor. He was positioned right outside the toilet, which I made a formal prediction would come back to bite him at some point. It did, and I was awoken into our second day on the road by the sounds of bird song the howls of Austin as Julian accidentally stood on him. Today, Jason wanted to see if we could come across some classic roadside attractions. I offered to Google if any were close, but he assured me that it'd be more fun to stop randomly at any we find naturally. Once we finished cooking up camp stove bacon and eggs for breakfast, Jason started driving. We had an hour of playing music and having a good time until the RV started to slow. I looked out the window to see a white, wooden house jutting in from the tree line. A sign over the door read, Aunt Teresa's Chandlery. We abandoned the camper where it was, and all of us, bar Julian, wandered up to the little shop's front door. It opened with a small bell's ring, and we found ourselves surrounded by dripping wax and the smell of herbs. The place had a homely but new-aged feel to it, and I had to keep vigilant so as not to step on one of the cats that swarmed the room. Jason combed inquisitively through the wide selection of candles on sale, while Austin tried to nurse his sudden headache. Just then, the beaded curtain that separated the first room from the next parted, and in walked a young African-American girl, maybe mid to late teens. She had frizzy hair tied back, thick braces, and a purple cardigan. "Oh, hi," she squeaked, chewing gum. "Hey," I replied and picked up a hexagonal green-blue candle. "Could I buy this?" "Sure," she said, "follow me." I followed her through the waterfall of beads and into a small front room. She ducked behind the counter in the corner and worked the register. The candle was $18, and I realized why they didn't have price tags on anything shortly after buying it. The 3 of us thanked her and left the store. "Charming," said Jason, camera hanging around his neck. $18 of candle, I blurted out, holding the candle in my hands and studying it. Is that normal or overpriced? I've never bought scented candles before, I can't tell. This conversation continued all the way back to the RV and halfway down the road. The rest of the day was spent looking out for more roadside attractions. By dusk, we'd seen a 20-foot-tall fiberglass chicken, which claimed to be the biggest in the state. If that wasn't enough, we stumbled across a gimmicky museum dedicated to salt and pepper shakers, as well as a plaque for a freak show performer known as the Eyeball Kid, who was apparently born without a body, whatever that meant. Jason had pictures of them all and seemed possessed by a childlike wonder whenever we spotted something out of the ordinary. We joined up onto the interstate and drove north, passing through Virginia before heading up into the mountainous roads of West Virginia. It was pitch black outside at this point, and with our stomachs full of fast food, we found a semi-safe looking area to park up at for the night, which we half hoped, half guessed wasn't on private land. We hadn't been shot at come dawn, so I assumed we guessed correctly. After a breakfast of leftovers and loose fruit, we started driving again. Julian was laying on my bed at the back of the RV, jotting away in a notebook. Austin and I were playing checkers. Jason, as always, was planted firmly behind the wheel. We were driving through a pretty forested, unexceptional rural backwater when it happened. I subconsciously felt the Winnebago slow and noticed as we came to a stop. I glanced out the small window to my left and saw only woodland. Jason undid his belt and slid out of the driver's seat. I watched him as he wordlessly opened the side door and stepped out. I looked back at Austin, who just shrugged. We both moved from our cramped seats and followed Jason outside to see what had gotten his attention. We walked to his side, where he was standing, squinting in the sun. A few yards in front of us was the ocean. The asphalt road petered out into a beige gradient where it met the sandbank. There was a narrow beach, running as far as eye could see in either direction. Beyond it was a vast open sea, with no hint of land on the horizon. I saw waves lap at the shore, but they made no sound. It was like a mirror, reflecting the blue of the sky. The three of us silently stood where we were, taking in the impossible sight. "Hey guys, why did we? Holy fuck," Julian muttered as he crept up behind us. I saw the trees around us on either side of the road stop abruptly where they met the sand line, like the forest had been cut surgically in half. Our confused group cautiously made their way onto the sandy beach, kicking at it as if to prove its existence. "Is this a lake?" asked Austin. "There wasn't one marked on the map," replied Jason as he crouched down by the waterside and looked out at its endless horizon. "And I don't think they could miss something like this." He dipped his hand into the water before bringing it to his nose. I watched in disgust as he brought it down to his mouth, stuck out his tongue, and tasted it. "Salt," he said, spitting onto the asphalt. "It's seawater." "It's not fucking seawater," laughed Julian. "It can't be." "That makes no sense." "None. Anyway, saltwater lakes are a thing, right?" While the two of them argued, and Austin dug around in the sand with his index finger, I stood and stared. Muttering under my breath, almost to myself, I said, "Strange how the road just stops." It was some time before we saw it. Julian had gone back onto the RV, but the rest of us refused to move on. Jason, Austin, and I wanted to explore the beach further and eventually enticed Julian out. The four of us made our way down the strip that ran parallel to the tree line. The beach was populated by the occasional shell, smooth stone, or hunk of driftwood. Just after I took Jason's picture and we decided to head back, a small blur appeared on the ocean's rim. Austin spotted it first, and we all stopped to look. The blur reflected the sunlight at odd angles and looked to be drawing nearer. It wasn't that long before we came to the sudden and mutual understanding that it was a boat. The boat, which we were now following intently, was coming to shore and strafing to the right as it did. Our little group kept pace with it, walking what felt like the entire length of the beach. Soon, the boat was near enough to make out the individual ropes and pulleys. I'd only ever been sailing once, and was far from familiar with any nautical terminologies, so pardon me if I make any mistakes. As we turned a bend in the shoreline, we came across a rickety-looking wooden pier that continued out maybe 20 yards into the sea. The white paint that covered the panels had all but flaked off, and the many posts were covered in old rope. Despite Jason's enthusiasm, we didn't walk onto the pier until we saw the sailing boat drift elegantly and stop at the end of the dock. Before any of us could say anything, Jason clambered onto the pier and strutted towards the now still ship. First, we called out to anyone who might be in the boat. When we got no reply back, we decided it was safe to explore. Jason was the first on as he eagerly climbed over the ship's railing and onto the deck. Once we made sure that the boat was tied securely to the dock with the thickest length of rope I'd ever seen, we followed him in on. The ship was a medium-sized sailboat, clearly abandoned and left to drift. Still, it wasn't in that bad of a condition. The rigging seemed to be intact, and the wooden floor seemed subject to only minor weathering. While me and Austin were snooping around the top deck, we heard Julian call us from down below. We passed down the hatchway and into the cramped lounge and sleeping quarters. Julian and Jason were slouched over the table, on which was a plate of half-eaten roast chicken and steamed greens next to a lukewarm cup of coffee. "This is so weird," mumbled Jason to himself with a tone of wonder and amazement. "Right, I'm going back to the RV," Julian said with a sigh and shrugged past us. Austin and I stood next to Jason and prodded the food with the same shared amazement. Our moment was shattered by Julian's scream. We sounded like a wounded animal, and the three of us rushed up to the top deck to see what had happened. As soon as I did, I stopped and looked around. There was no land anywhere in sight. None. I turned to my friends and saw the same terrifying realization plastered on their faces. Surrounding us, from the boat to the horizon, was open water. We must have got loose. Drifted, Jason began to reason with himself. This was 2 weeks ago. The four of us have been drifting since. We've never seen land, felt hunger, and we just can't settle on how long it's been. For me, at least, we've been drifting for 2 weeks. Austin commits to the idea that we've only been on the boat for a few hours and still busies himself trying to find a way off. Maybe he's right, since my phone, the way I'm getting this message out to you all, still has plenty of juice. Jason sides with me, saying that we've only been here for a few weeks, a month tops. But Julian now sits in the narrow corner of the cabin. He doesn't move, doesn't speak, but in his glassy eyes I can see the despair of years. Please, I have no idea how you can help us, but you must. You must. If you ever find the ocean where it shouldn't be, then you found us. Please, come searching. You're our only hope. I took part in a corporate survey. My sanity didn't make it through intact. There was little I wouldn't do for money, although I'd recently drawn the line at drug testing. Call me lazy, but I just despise the idea of working a 9 to 5, and have done since I was old enough to skip school. Still, I live what I would regard as comfortably with what work I do get, and a little extra on the side from dodgy online gambling sites. Today, I had signed up to be part of some corporate focus group thing. Joining over email, I'd been given directions to their nearest site, which was surprisingly, and conveniently, quite near my apartment. On the outside, it looked like just another one of the drab, gray, inner-city buildings that came with urban decay. Past the front doors, however, was a lavish, almost Regent-era waiting room. Ornately carved dark mahogany walls ended in a row of finely upholstered red leather seats. As had been instructed in the email, I sat down and waited for someone to come through the double doors on the far side of the room. After 20 minutes of chewing through a pack of apple-flavored gum and aimlessly scrolling short-form media on my phone, someone did. She was a tall woman in a slender red dress. She wore a noose of pearls, and her tar-black hair was pulled uncomfortably tight along her scalp, ending in a fist-sized bun. "I'm Lilith," she said as she walked towards me, her stilettos clacking loudly. "You must be a volunteer for the sample testing." I stood, smiled, and shook her hand. "That's right," I replied, and then parroted her name back to her. "Lilith, like the psychologist from that show?" She smiled with scant amusement. "I'm afraid I'm not familiar," she said. For some reason, I felt a tinge of embarrassment. She was a beautiful woman, after all, and seeing as she had no wedding ring, I reckoned I could have her number before the end of the session. "I said follow me," Lilith repeated. I didn't hear her first command, but apologized still and followed her through the double doors. Behind them was a long, equally gothic corridor that ended in a much more industrial-looking door. She opened it, and we entered a small, sterile room. The white walls looked like the enamel shell of a bathroom sink, and I was attacked by the overwhelming smell of cleaning products. "Take a seat," said Lilith as she gestured to the sturdy, iron chair that lay in the center of the room. It was the one piece of furniture, or really anything other than white tiling, that I could make out. As she had asked, I sat. The seat was uncomfortable, but I didn't think I'd be here long. As such, I didn't make a fuss. I looked up at Lilith, who produced a clipboard from nowhere in particular. She held it out, and I took it from her hands. "Please fill in all fields," she ordered and turned away. "I will be back in 15 minutes. I smiled at her and watched her hips sway gently as she closed the door behind her, leaving me on my own. I leaned back, trying to make out a comfortable position in the rigid, cubist chair. I failed and unclipped the pen from the side of the clipboard. I flipped back to the front page and quietly read the first part of the survey to myself. "Please answer all questions thoroughly and honestly. Not doing so will result in payment nullification." I chuckled at the stock warning that came with all of these corporate surveys. I've bent the truth plenty of times on these sorts of things, and they've never caught me out. My eyes fell on the first question. The simplest one, of course. Name. I scribbled it down along the dotted line next to the loan word and moved on to the next question. Occupation. I was functionally unemployed, but decided to use my usual answer of poet. It was practically the truth anyway, as I did fancy myself as something of a poet. After a few more personal questions on the first page, I flipped over to the second and was greeted with rows of multiple choice. How satisfied are you with your current position in life? I smirked. I still wasn't sure what the survey was about, or even what company I was doing it for, but from this question, I guessed it was something to do with selling a certain lifestyle. You saw things like this all the time. Advertising now seemed to leap on the idea for every single mundane product. I felt sick of hearing how an adult sippy cup was supposed to revolutionize my way of being. I scanned the possible answers to the questions, realizing I didn't relate to any of them. In the end, I thoughtlessly ticked the box that corresponded with moderately satisfied. The next question was even more open-ended. Do you enjoy life? Answering this one took less internal debate. I ticked yes, and moved on to the next one. Are there people in your life that you would regard as important to you? The possible answers descending beneath it ranged from none to countless. I sniffed stoically and marked in the first option. It wasn't exactly true. I had my mother, of course, but who cares with these surveys? I barely read the questions anyway. I skimmed over the next question, and I'm afraid I couldn't tell you what it was. Something to do with intangible concepts like happiness and fulfillment, no doubt. I turned the page and saw that the next segment was a series of yes or no questions. I unwisely chewed the top of the pen and read through them. Did you have a generally happy childhood? Yes. Do you still speak with one or both of your parents? Yes. Have you volunteered for community work in the past 18 months? No. Do you have a history of substance abuse? Yes. Do you have a close-knit group of friends? Yes, I lied. Are you generally regarded as trustworthy by those who know you? Yes. Do you believe in God? I was taken aback by the sudden religious curveball. I was resigned to just powering through the questions with little thought, but this one made me stop and think. I was born into a religious family, and my mother was still certainly devout. I attended church often in my youth, as I had been forced to, but now I rarely did. It had been years, in fact, since I had walked over hallowed ground. After much deliberation, I ticked the small square on the page next to the word no. Some more filler later, I turned onto what I then believed to be the last page of the survey. In front of me were 3 questions, each with suitable amounts of dotted lines below them that instructed me to answer freely. The first of them cemented my theory that this was all for some sort of socio-medical startup. I was sure of it now, but I'd still make a point of asking Lilith when she came back. I read and reread the first question on that page until it unlocked something that had lain dormant in my Stillwater memory since childhood. What was the most physically painful personal experience of your life? For my 6th birthday, my parents bought me a bike. I'd been pleading for one constantly, and since my family was one on the other side of the tracks, it was the only present they could afford to get me that year. I didn't much care, though. I cherished it. At least, I did for a week or two. There was a storm not too long after my birthday. No severe damage came from it, but a few loose tiles had been blown from the roof. On one particular dry and somewhat sunny day, I decided to take my bike out for a ride. I still use stabilizers and would for the foreseeable future. The reality of riding a bike ended up terrifying me, and I barely had enough confidence to cycle the small path that encircled my home. As I was saying, this one day I did. I took my bike from the shed and began to ride. My mother was outside, I vividly remember. I was riding, and she cheered me on from her garden chair, sipping a drink of sorts and reading a magazine. I was coming in hot around one corner of our home, maybe a little too fast. One unsecure bolt on my bike's stabilizers gave way and flipped vertically, sending me flying. I had no real garden, only a scattering of gravel. A broken shard of slate, blown from the roof, lay at an angle pointing out from it was lodged in the gravel. When I fell, the sharpened fragment cut into the base of my shin. As I fell forward, my bicycle came down on top of me. The shard sliced upwards, degloving the surface layer of flesh from my shin bone. I can remember then my mother running to my side and helping me up, only for her footing to falter when she saw the red of the blood and the white of my bone. A strange numbness kept the pain at bay for some time, but not forever. By the time the ambulance took me away, I was screaming my throat raw. I recounted this experience in a small, scribbled-out summary and moved on to the next question. What happens after we die? I answered simply, nothing. The final question of the survey, or at least this part of it, was as follows. What is more painful than living an eternity away from the light of God? It was a clearly subjective, philosophical question. There was no right or wrong answer, so I was confident in writing down whatever came to mind. After some pen chewing, I decided to answer with my ill-advised attempt at humor, spending an hour with my ex-wife. With that, the survey was done. I reset the page order on the clipboard and tried, once again, to find a comfortable position in the steel chair as I waited for Lilith to return. I failed, but it didn't matter as I quickly heard the rhythmic click of her stilettos just behind the door. I turned to it right as it opened, and my hostess walked in. "I take it you've finished," she said, rather than asked. "I have," I replied, holding the survey out to her, "but I have a few questions before I go." She took the clipboard dutifully from me. I began to stand up from the chair and she soured. "Please remain seated," barked Lilith. Confused by her sudden outburst, I sat back down and watched her fumble with the small handbag by her waist, the one she just slid the survey into. "I'm sorry, is there another part to the survey? Should I began, but faltered. Lilith took a polished, blue metal handgun from the bag. It was a small thing, but seemed weighty in her grasp. A low squeak was all that escaped my gaping mouth as she pressed the barrel against my forehead. My eyes widened in sudden realization and were kept open by inaction. Lilith pulled the trigger and sent a thumbnail-sized piece of lead alloy traveling at 300 meters per second into my brain. The first thing I felt was the heat. It reminded me of the flash of discomfort that came with putting your hand too close to a stove top. Only it persisted and wrapped around my body like a chrysalis. The next thing to hit me was an overwhelming thirst, and then a wave of fatigue as I stood up. After rubbing them vigorously with the palm of my hand, my eyes started to focus. I looked around me and whimpered. The landscape had the mind-breaking intensity of a Hieronymus Bosch painting. I realized that I was standing on a small hill that overlooked a thinning plateau and collapsed into a dark canyon not too far from my position. The black sand under me started to burn away at the soles of my shoes, and I moved a foot forward. Then the other. Before I knew it, I had begun to walk forward. I soon reached the edge of the canyon. My eyes watered as I saw the fetid stream that had carved the ravine through the landscape. Hundreds, thousands, countless human corpses moved fluidly down a snaking path. The stench that came from the river of bodies was unbearable. I staggered back, leaving the nightmarish view in my wake. As I ran, my mind slowly breaking, I registered a shrieking noise that came from all around me. My head shot up and I saw them. Things flew through the carmine sky that looked like a cross between a hawk and a pile of rusting cutlery. Some swooped every which way, others circled ritualistically like vultures eyeing roadkill. I let out a scream of my own as one dove towards me. The thing's iron talon tore through my shoulder. I kicked and flailed as it picked me up from the ground. The amalgam flew with me gored underneath it. I felt like my arm could tear from the socket at any moment. The pain was more than I thought I could bear. The thing started to fall from the sky, then lifted again. This repeated a few more times, getting lower to the ground with each. Thankfully, I was too heavy for it to carry. As soon as my feet touched the charred ground, I rolled forward, the claw popping from my wound. I scrambled under a rotting wooden cart covered in a red ivy. I hid there and watched the thing fly away to join the rest of the metallic flock. They were now locked in battle with what looked like men, victims of tar and feathering, who now bore mangled swan wings and darted through the air. I curled up into a ball and cried, "What was this? What had I done to deserve it?" In the hours I spent sobbing under that cart, I heard things that made my ears bleed. Things that tore my trust in humanity to ribbons. Things that I will hear at the edge of sleep for an eternity. My mental anguish outweighed the physical pain that came with the burns that now covered my body. Touching the black dust that covered the ground was like walking over an open fire. Eventually, I physically couldn't cry anymore. I rolled around onto my side and whimpered. Gradually, while I lay on the upturned cart, I felt the air around me cool, my breath grow visible. Soon, I was a shivering mess. Black snow started to fall. Within the hour, my fingertips were frostbitten. I knew if I stayed where I was, I would freeze to death, if there even was such a thing anymore. I saw fire off in the distance while I was being hoisted by that metal amalgam. I crawled out from under the cart and began to trudge westward. In a blizzard of black snow, I lost all direction. It felt like moving through an endless void. I almost walked into the ruined stone wall when it suddenly loomed from the darkness. I collapsed against it and followed its edge until I found a door. I opened it and felt inside. There was a pit in the center of the room. From within it rose flames whose sparks licked at the ceiling. A man sat on a stone chair in the corner of the room. Crouched down, he was already 3 times my size. He wore a red robe that fell to his knees. Beneath it was more black, tattered cloth. His gangrenous feet were hobbled and bent fully backwards. From his mouth came a long, brass pipe. The white skin of his lips seemed to morph to its base. By his side was a bloated pig dressed as a nun. The door on the far side of the room opened, and a naked, malnourished man walked in. He sheepishly bowed to the red-robed figure. His panicked stutter made him speak in ellipsis. Before he could adequately make his point, the red-robed figure took him by his neck, lifted him in the air, and gored him on a pale knife he took from within his garbs. He tore it down from the man's clavicle to his pelvis, disemboweling as he went. The poor man screamed in impossible distress. The red-robed figure threw him into the pit of flames, letting his useless body turn to ash as his swine squealed in delight. Then he turned and looked at me. I burst from the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran, realizing that the blizzard had slowly subsided. In the unending darkness that came with the snowfall, I hadn't noticed that I'd wandered into something of a small town. The streets were engulfed in pandemonium. Market stalls sold human flesh, dishing out as a confectionery to the town's citizens. Those citizens were of an insectoid mammalian ichthytic admixture and gnawed on cooked limbs as they passed me. I stumbled through the street, which was littered with dead fish, severed hands, and vomit. All around me was death and murder, with both the victims and perpetrators rejoicing in it. The most human of the crowd wore mishmashed scraps of old armor, which seemed to mesh with their feeble bodies. One burst out in front of me, his right arm replaced with a fiddle and his left with the bow. He played a tearing screech as he passed me, grinning in my face with his dozens of extra teeth. A dull conquistador helmet was bolted into his head, obstructing everything above the bridge of his nose. I pushed, panicked, past endless crowds of the deformed. Finally, I found myself in the town square. On the far side, hidden behind the foreground, was a great tower. It rose higher than any other structure around it, almost touching the sky. At the very top, it was covered in rustic scaffolding, clearly still under construction. Winged workers carried bricks stolen from the town's buildings up to the new tower, adding to its height with a frenzied dedication. Surrounding me, on the street level, were countless tables lined with countless gamblers. They bet anything on everything, from poker to Russian roulette. What had once been an ornately carved marble fountain had been destroyed and turned into a makeshift dog-fighting arena. While the deformed danced and cheered and clapped, men and women who appeared more like me were brutalized. They hung flayed like grotesque ornaments from long posts that dotted the town. 2 pig-headed things in long Venetian robes stabbed repeatedly into nude beggars that lined the gutters. No amount of bludgeoning seemed to kill them, though. Their torture was truly endless. I wondered if mine would be. Despite my best attempts at rationalization, I knew what this was. I knew where I was. I was in hell. A hand rested on my shoulder. Too afraid to turn, my eyes did their best at determining the thing behind me from where I stood. Straining them in their sockets, I saw that long, jagged splinters of thick wood protruded from under his fingernails. I couldn't imagine the pain. I hoped neither could he. I turned and saw the man in full. He was old, weathered. His wrinkling skin was like leather. His hair and beard were long and gray and matted with dried blood. By his side was a small child, maybe 6 or 7, neat blonde hair and bright blue eyes. His shirt was off, and I could see the baby goat that grew out of his abdomen at odd angles like a parasitic twin. I dropped to my knees. I clutched at the hems of the old man's long coat and begged. I begged for a second chance, to be let into heaven. What had I done to deserve this? I always tried to be a good person, after all. I wept into his jacket, expecting sympathy. Seeing his suffering, I thought he was another one like me. Another person cast into this furnace, only to find brief companionship in his fellow condemned. I was wrong. The old man grabbed my hair, the splinters in his fingernails gouging his exposed nerves as he did. At the pain, he smiled. He yanked my head back, forcing me to look him in his eyes. They looked like rotting duck eggs. When he spoke, I noticed that his teeth were absent. In their place were rows and rows of fly larvae. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but instead cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, he preached in an animalistic tone, what chance do you think you have? Beside him, the child bleated. With that, he took a large hand scythe from his overcoat and stabbed it into my side. I lurched back, freeing myself from his grasp and in the process, tearing a gash in my scalp. As I scrambled along the moist street floor, the goatish child leapt on me. He sank his sturdy teeth onto my leg, biting deep straight to the marrow of my shin bone. If my throat wasn't on fire, I would have screamed. I put a hand up in a pitiful attempt to stop the old man's approach. He swung the hand scythe again. This time, in a crescent arc, it cut through my palm. Now secured, he began to drag me by my wound through the street as the child began devouring the meat of my calf muscle. All around me, similar scenes erupted. A giant human head had broken up from the street tiles. Winged demons threw fellow sufferers into its gaping maw to face a second death by mastication. The condemned who surrounded were beaten and broken, crippled and rendered to piles of meat. I couldn't fathom another second, let alone an eternity. The old man finally reached his destination further down the street. The buildings here looked like large concrete recreations of alchemic beakers and tubing. There was a strange beauty in their dilapidated state. Outside one of the structures was a tall, narrow pole. Made of wood, a rope hangs from a brass pulley at its summit. It ended in a thick hook. The old man dragged me to its base and slid the hand scythe from me. He took the dangling hook and tore it through the base of my chin. It ripped up through my lower jaw, its sharp tip peeping from my mouth. I spat out teeth and parts of my tongue. I gave up in that moment and waited for a death that would never come. The old man took the second part of the rope and started to hoist me. Slowly, my feet left the ground. Not too long after, the goatish child fell from my now purely skeletal leg. I was hoisted like a flag of surrender. Children covered in tumors emerged from their houses and started throwing rocks at me. I could feel every nerve ending, every pang of pain. The antonym of bliss overcame my senses. Every time I thought I reached the precipice of human suffering, something nudged me a little further. Then I felt the heat. I'm sure it was there for a long time before I noticed it, considering my senses were largely destroyed. There was always the background pain of burning since I arrived, but this was something more. I heard a noise like thunder and from my bird's eye view saw a blinding light encircle the town. It came in almost faster than I could perceive. It was a great firestorm, like the product of a hydrogen bomb. It moved like a devastating tsunami. Everyone and thing in its path was turned to dust in less than an instant. I could have wept at the thought of its salvation. The roaring plasma reached me within the second, and I felt it burn away my surface layer of flesh. Hell still refused me a quick end. Eventually, I found solace, as my ashes mixed with that of the ruined landscape. I jolted suddenly on the white-tiled floors. The smell of cleaning products was almost unbearable. It took me some time to figure out the use of my body again. The pain was gone, but the memory of it still paralyzed me. Eventually, I rediscovered enough self-control to lurch onto my hands and knees. I looked around me and confirmed that I was back in the sterile room. Was this some sort of second chance? I looked again and saw the clipboard laying near the door. I crawled at an agonizing pace towards it. Every movement took expert planning and execution. Every fiber in my body felt like it was being piloted independently. An unknowable amount of time later, I reached the clipboard. It was, as I guessed, the survey. However, all the pages I'd filled in had been flipped back. There was another one looking up at me, a new one. How would you rate your experience? Please circle one of the following. Beneath the printed words were a set of smiley faces, ranging from overjoyed to happy to neutral to sad and finally ending blind rage. I lay in front of the clipboard for some time. Exhausted, I realized I didn't have a pen this time. I took a shaky breath in and bit the tip of my right index finger. Hard. The skin broke and blood came gushing out. I reached forward and circled the last printed face, the most unsatisfied of the bunch, in my own blood. Once it was complete, I collapsed back down. My eyes felt heavy and my brain urged me to close them, to go to sleep. Still, when I heard the clacking of heels on a hardwood floor, I knew it had to fight to stay awake. I was looking up at the door when it opened. "Oh, you poor thing," said Lilith as she dropped to her knees. Something not quite malice but far from warmth coated her words. She locked her arms around my shoulders and helped me to my feet. Once I was steady, she crouched down again and took the clipboard in my hands. She inspected it while I bent double and heaved, then shot me a smile. "Looks like we're all done here," she told me and began to lead me back down the way I came in. "Thank you so much for your time. Your feedback will really help us improve our service." Through the ornate halls and into the lobby, she practically pushed me out the front door. Once again, I was outside. It was dark now. The building I came out of returned to its unimposing gray self. I sheepishly looked up at Lilith. "What service?" I asked, stuttering my way through the words. She smiled and closed the drab front door, cutting off the warm light that came from within. I stood dumbfounded for a minute or two before I tried the handle. It was stiff and felt like moving granite. I started to slam my body weight into the door, shoulder first. Eventually, it swung open. Behind was a dank and unused storage room. The concrete floors were moistened by a still dripping pipe somewhere overhead. Vermin scuttled in the darkness. I frowned and closed the door again. It was unexplainable, but far from the weirdest thing I'd seen that day. Not even in the top 20, I'd wager. I walked down the alley until I came to the main street. Few people were out this late, but a lone taxi was parked in its bay. I got in and asked the driver for a lift to my apartment. We arrived 15 minutes later. "That'll be €16.30, the driver barked. I reached into my pockets and quickly realized that I'd left my wallet at home that morning. I groaned and fished around for loose change. I felt something crumpled in my back pocket. I prayed it was a €20 note and took it out. It was an envelope. On the front was written "Payment Lilith." I tore it open and counted out the change inside. €16.30 on the dot. I handed the envelope to the driver and got out. I took a few steps, fell to my knees and started to cry. Those were tonight's stories. If you like them, remember to like and subscribe and share in the comments which one will be keeping you awake. Until we meet again, take care and watch the shadows.